Lawyers, can you think of a particularly challenging client that took you by surprise? Story 1. The manipulative ex-paralegal covered in feces. Client represented himself. I was appointed as his attorney advisor. He was a former paralegal who did everything he could to make the process hard for everyone, so the prosecutor or judge would just give him a good plea deal to go away. To prevent us from holding a hearing, he would strip naked, coat himself in his own feces, and then refuse to exit his cell. So cell extraction would have to go wrestle him out of the cell. While he was covered in waste, we would obviously have to adjourn. He would spit at people. He would reach into his pants in court, grab out feces, and smear it all over his head. He would cuss at people. He would try to get judges to recuse themselves by biasing them against him, by insulting them thoroughly. I'd like to see you. Removed sexually explicit comment, judge, and worse things. He would file dozens of frivolous motions, and then argue them for forever. He wasn't mentally ill or a wacko. He knew exactly what he was doing, and frankly, it worked. He ended up getting an amazing deal because everyone wanted to be done with him. Story 2. The paranoid poop thrower with intense prejudices. Client tried to represent himself, but was denied by the judge because he was clearly mentally incapable. He's mentally ill, but that doesn't excuse his intense prejudice against gay people. He's also a feces thrower similar to the last guy. He has consistently made up being sexually assaulted at the jail because he thinks it means the court will have to dismiss the case and let him out of jail. He repeatedly has claimed that the guards are all gay and that they and the other inmates contaminate his food in a sexual manner at the jail. The judge at one point apologized if he was getting more salt in his diet than desired. He lies to me consistently because he thinks if he tells me, oh, this was dismissed already, I'll believe him, go tell the judge, and just magically get the case dismissed. Anytime I tell him anything, he argues with me about how he knows better. I can't even explain the process to him without him telling me how I'm wrong. Some of it comes from his paranoia, but honestly I doubt he'll become a nice guy when he's under proper treatment. Story 3. The sexist abuser who couldn't respect women. Client accused of attacking the mother of his child while she was holding the child in her arms. The regular public defender had to withdraw because he kept talking down to her because she was a woman. He would call her a sweetheart. He thinks the judge is biased against him because she's a woman. When she called him on his sexism, he launched in this rant about how he has a mother and sisters, as if that matters. Total jerk. Threatened to fire me in the first conversation. Seemed unsure how to proceed when I told him I didn't care. When I discussed the incident with him, he essentially admitted that he did it because his baby's mother had insulted him, and he felt a visceral need to put her in her place. Story 4. The arrogant noise violator who wouldn't listen. Client accused of noise violation, literally the most minor misdemeanor ever. He was absolutely adamant that he had a constitutional right to play music as loud as he wanted, and anytime anyone tried to tell him otherwise, he'd cut them off and yell at them about his freedoms. I had a 30-minute conversation with this guy in which I struggled to even explain the basic process to him because he kept cutting me off. He repeatedly insulted me, saying I was too dumb to realize how he was going to get off. He kept saying his case should be dismissed because some white guy from wealthy suburb got off on constitutional grounds, so I should too. Maybe I should look up his lawyer, so you can talk to someone who's actually good at his job, and he can tell you how to do your job. Have you even heard of the First Amendment? I repeatedly explained to him that the police in that case explicitly admitted to arresting the guy for playing a song with profane lyrics about the police, whereas in this case, the officer just arrested him for blasting music in a city park. But he would not listen. I actually had to try the case. It was the dumbest thing ever. The cop was like, "Yep, he did it." Client insisted on testifying and on cross-examination, admitted that he had installed huge speakers in his car and that you could hear him playing his music 80 to 90 feet away, far more than. Story 5. The DUI winner who drove drunk to court. I won a driving under the influence case because the government messed up on something right before trial was to begin. My client gives me a hug and completely reeks of alcohol. He is driven to court. I took his keys and called his mother. Story 6. The middle-aged man blaming a child. Client, who was accused of inappropriate contact with a 12-year-old. He was mid-40s at the time, and I had to shut him down real quick when he tried to tell me how the 12-year-old was supposedly initiating the contact. Story 7. The thief who stole from her own lawyer. I represented a woman for a grand theft charge. Left her in my office to get some things copied before she left. After she left, I realized my sunglasses and car keys were stolen. I tracked her down in the lobby and told her I was not going to represent her anymore and I would call the police if she didn't empty her pockets in front of me and give me my things. Story 8. The released man who assaulted immediately. I had a client who was released after 25 years in prison for a past homicide, and then the same day he assaulted his prospective new landlord. He ended up getting another 10 years. He was unrepentant and laughed about how he hit the guy with such force that he caused a severe eye injury. I thought, this guy deserves to be in prison. Took the case to trial anyway and, shocker, lost, and he got 10, the max. Story 9. The fake doctor preying on cancer patients. Client who pretended to be a doctor so he could sell steroids. According to the government, he had numerous clients who were made to believe that his steroids would cure their cancer. They paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and some of them died. I just thought that was pure evil. Story 10. The traumatized teen who snapped in a silo. I've done a lot of prison legal aid, and I could tell stories about child molesters that would turn you green, but instead I'll turn you green a different way. I had a kid, 17, who was mildly cognitively disabled due to brain trauma he sustained at the hands of his birth parents, who ended up with a really wonderful foster care family and thrived. He was a popular kid in school, good athlete, got a girlfriend, and invited her to meet up and be teenagers one night in a corn silo, which I guess is a thing that country kids do. I don't know, this all comes from the pre-sentence investigation report I read before taking his case. But this girl met him at the silo, and they were hanging out inside. By his account, they were having a nice time and he was really enjoying himself. Then for no particular reason, he picked up a piece of wood and fatally attacked her. He then used farm implements to handle her remains and buried them in the corn and went home like nothing had happened. Hey, you asked? Story 11. The group intimacy that turned violent. Oh, I can share a good story. I had a teacher in high school who was a former lawyer. We always asked him why he gave up his practice to start teaching. He finally caved and explained that his last case was the defense of 3 people. Apparently there had been a 4th. It was 2 couples who, in the act of a drunken gathering involving substance use and group intimacy, decided to end one of the women's lives in a gruesome manner, which included dismemberment and acts of cannibalism. I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time. As a lawyer, he said it was pretty open and shut, but he had to get his clients the best result possible, and he was exposed to all the horrid details, the pictures, and their reasoning. My teacher had such a far-off look. Story 12. The monstrous abuser in an eviction case. I'm a legal services attorney, which is essentially a public defender but for civil issues like housing and debt collection defense. So I don't get to pick my clients. As you can imagine, I've represented quite the cast of characters. I haven't regretted winning anything, because this is what I've signed up for, and I truly believe everyone deserves legal representation when they need it. But I certainly don't love all of my clients. The worst client I had was a monstrous, abusive man with a substance abuse problem, whose landlord was attempting to evict him after the cops came for the umpteenth time. I sympathized with the landlord and hated my jerk of a client, who called me a horrible name no less than 15 times. But I prevented the eviction. Story 13. The dark-eyed client seeking revenge. Had to defend a guy who got charged for the sexual assault of his stepmother. I was incredibly hesitant about taking the case but decided to do a 1-hour free briefing with him out of curiosity. Turns out his stepmother had sexually abused him for 6 years, and one day something snapped in his brain. He didn't care in the slightest about what happened to him, and was an incredibly difficult client to defend. The stepmother had all kinds of proof, so we ended up pleading him guilty, and just try and get the lowest sentence we could. He had enough going on in his head that he ended up being transferred from prison to a psychiatric ward after a few months. I've never felt so uncomfortable talking to a person you could tell there was something dark in his eyes and he couldn't care less about it. Story 14. Lawyer regrets winning case that led to financial ruin for all parties. An ex-boss of mine has spent over 7 years litigating a relatively small case, about $300,000 in total liability. The defendants refused to settle, and their lawyer was totally inept and possibly mentally ill, filing all kinds of voluminous, 1,000-plus pages, and totally frivolous motions. He appealed every magistrate ruling to the district judge, and then tried to appeal every district judge ruling to the Federal Court of Appeals. He was even sanctioned for his conduct, which he of course appealed to the Court of Appeals. Case goes to trial. Plaintiffs win about $300,000 in damages, and a whopping $600,000 in attorney's fees. Defendants appeal the jury verdict and lose, then separately appeal the fee determination and lose. Then they refuse to pay the judgment. We bring a post-judgment proceeding to overturn obvious fraudulent transfers they made after the trial, giving away their houses and other property to friends and family, etc. Midway through this procedure, they file for bankruptcy. The whole thing is just a mess for everyone. My ex-boss is basically financially ruined by this case, still waiting for, now $800,000 plus, in attorney's fees he's probably never going to get to collect. The defendants were financially ruined by their crazy attorney, who clocked them over $300,000 in fees while ruining their lives. Their friends and family members have been drawn into the litigation over the fraudulent transfers, and they may well end up facing jail time due to fraudulent statements on their bankruptcy filings. The plaintiffs are still waiting on wages they should have been paid almost 10 years ago. Oh, and I got laid off because my ex-boss couldn't afford to pay me anymore after all of this. So yeah, all in all, maybe it would have been better if he'd lost the case years ago. Story 15. Public defender feels crappy after winning dismissal for abusive client. I'm a third-year law student, but intern at a public defender office and hold a certificate from my state Supreme Court allowing me to practice. A lot of domestic violence cases get dismissed because the spouse recants and won't testify. After reviewing the client's file by reading the victim statement and looking at photos of women with black eyes and bruised faces, and seeing the cheerful client happy his case is over, just to probably abuse her again next time, I feel a bit crappy. Story 16. Lawyer regrets winning case for client who later reoffended. Had a client who had been convicted of sexual assault and was just finishing up his prison sentence. The state was pushing to have him declared a chronic offender and have him civilly committed after he got out of prison, but he didn't quite meet the criminal history criteria. We won on that one, but less than a month later he was arrested for assaulting a sex worker who struggled with addiction. I don't regret representing him. The state should never be allowed to bend the rules on imposing a penalty as drastic as permanent civil commitment, but I do regret that the law didn't make adequate provision for dealing with guys like him. I'll also always wonder if the second victim wasn't a setup. I wonder if somebody in the county prosecutor's office didn't tell her what kind of history this guy had with minors, and offer her a get-out-of-jail-free card or substances out of the evidence locker or something. Story 17. Intern traumatized by violent videos. Even though I've made a throwaway, I'm going to be a bit vague because I still take my ethical duties to former clients seriously and can't breach privilege or the non-disclosure agreement I signed. This is a story from a long time ago, during the summer after my first year of law school, when I was briefly working at a well-known criminal defense firm. The client whose case I was working was one of several defendants charged with conspiracy to commit harm. 3 individuals had committed the acts, and several others had either helped plan it, abducted the victims, came along to watch, or filmed it. In order to see whether our client was one of the individuals present at the scene, I had to watch multiple videos of the events. I watched multiple people brutally harmed in about the worst possible way you can imagine. They were subjected to extreme and fatal violence, including dismemberment. It wasn't some grainy security footage. It was high-definition video taken by bystanders just a few feet away. The video showed the graphic details of the attacks and the victims' final moments. I also had to listen to the audio to see if our client's voice could be heard. The screams were bad. The laughter was worse. It has stuck with me for years and years, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. Thankfully, my internship at that firm ended a few weeks later at the end of the summer. I never looked up the sentence from the case, and have no desire to. In our case, there was no presumption of innocence. The individuals involved had all taken pleas, in hope that the prosecutors wouldn't seek the death penalty. The only thing that would change was whether our client would get the death penalty, if he was present or filming, or life in prison, if we showed that he played a more minimal role. Working in criminal defense meant setting my judgment for people aside, so that they could be afforded the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. I still did my job to the best of my ability, but I found myself lying awake at night for several weeks in a row, praying to every god that I knew that each of those people involved would face the ultimate penalty, and that someone would laugh at their screams too. After that internship, I never returned to criminal law. I now practice civil law, where I help people recover for wrongs done to them. Story 18. Lawyer hears 911 call of violent attack. I listened to a 911 call where the victim was attacked with a blade to her throat while on the call by our client. I will never forget her making sounds of severe injury and saying, "He killed me, he killed me." Somehow she ultimately lived through this. Story 19. District Attorney disturbed by child starvation case. I'm on the other side, but I've got a defendant who went to prison for starving 3 adopted children to the point that they needed weeks of hospitalization, then got out of prison and married a guy with children so that she could start starving them too. Listening to her interview, where she attempts to justify what she did to both sets of kids, disturbed me more than any of the harm cases I've worked on. Story 20. Lawyer views exploitation evidence. When I had to go to the U.S. Attorney's office to view the evidence in his case, there they were, the hundreds of images of child exploitation material he had traded. This included material he had created himself. I realized he just could not help himself. But he also never once claimed responsibility or showed remorse, so I don't feel too badly for him. Story 21. Client refuses to pay victim's medical bills. I had a client who was accused of domestic violence. Essentially, he threw his girlfriend out of a second-story window. Now, he's got a terrible history, but so do a lot of my clients, and his attitude is a little entitled, also typical. But he also knows the deal and wants a plea deal. So I'm not really prepared when he absolutely refuses the no-jail offer from the state. Keep in mind, there were like 5 witnesses. Why? Because they wanted him to pay for her medical bills. Okay, a jerk, but whatever, not the worst. What did it was his counteroffer. I ain't paying her bills. Tell them I'll pay for the window. The prosecutor was not happy. Story 22. Old lady screams at lawyer, loses discount on lien payoff. I calculated a payoff on a judgment because we had a judgment lien on a house that would be sold soon. The seller of the house calls me. She couldn't be more sympathetic. She's an old lady crying on the phone, recently lost some family members, can't afford to pay off the full lien amount because she needs the money to also pay off her medical debt. I tell my client that we should probably cut her a break, but we'd need a copy of the Department of Housing and Urban Development statement to know the numbers before we can decide. After all, if she's walking away from closing with $150,000 in cash, then we're probably not cutting much off our $11K lien. Client agrees, I call the borrower back just to give her a heads up that we'll need the HUD statement so we can make an informed decision. The tone changes completely. She is absolutely enraged, starts screaming at me and saying how awful we are. I tell her, hey, I understand you're in a really stressful time, but if you keep being nasty with me, then my willingness to work with you on this is going to run out. Rather than taking the second chance, she proceeds to keep screaming at me. We ended up cutting some of the balance off, but not nearly as much as she would have gotten had she not started screaming at me. Story 23. Client cancels bankruptcy twice. Lawyer refuses to help again. Had one not too long ago. Older woman who had been scammed. Ended up in a bunch of debt and got behind on her mortgage. I agreed to help her with a Chapter 13 bankruptcy to save the house. Had an appointment set, but then last minute canceled because she decided to just sell the house. I tell her good luck. Fast forward a bit, she calls me back and says she's decided to do the bankruptcy after all. We set another appointment. Again, last minute, she calls me telling about a company that emailed her unsolicited, red flag, and when she called, they said they got her info from the mortgage company, red flag, and that for the low price of thousands of dollars, red flag, they could get her mortgage payment to a specific number, red flag. I tell her that there is a decent chance this place is a scam. But even if it wasn't, at best, they're going to charge her to try for a loan modification, which already was denied before she even contacted me. I tell her she can do what she wants, but I'm not getting jerked around anymore for such an obviously bad idea. Either work with me or don't. She waffles, says she'll stick with me, then cancels our meeting by email later that day. I tell her good luck, have a nice life. She then calls me again a week later, saying I was right, and she wants to hire me. Seems shocked when I tell her I'm not interested, given that she already bailed twice and didn't listen to me when I gave her advice. Story 24. Trust stops paying lawyer after being forced to move funds. For me, it was the hand feeding me. I represented someone who had a multi-million-dollar special needs trust to pay for stuff due to a medical malpractice incident that left them disabled. The trust mismanaged the funds and how they distributed those funds, leading the state to ask to get paid back for all the Medicaid and other benefits my client had received over the last 4 years, max allowed by statute. The trust hired me to defend my client and their client against the state. We did win in the end, 2 years, multiple hearings, and several appeals later. But it cost $50,000 in fees and, in all honesty, was the fault of the trust and how they operated. Cue me saying to my client she has to fire her trust and move the funds to a new trustee. She loved that idea. The state backed down from a third attempt to seize the trust at that idea. The trust? Not so much. The trust was paying my bills during this process. I say _ because the day they got my letter we were moving the trust, I got $0 from them. Had to get paid by the new trust after the fact. Eventually, I was able to connect with a few folks at the trust years later, and they understood that I did what I had to. But they also weren't going to pay a penny for me to take that money out of their hands, so it was their way of giving me the finger, even though I was right. Story 25. Client demands last-minute document review. Client sits on draft documents for 2 weeks. Client, 2 weeks later at 4:30 p.m. Have reviewed drafts. Need them to go out to the other side at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Here are my instructions that don't make any sense, and answer only 4 out of the 10 questions you required instructions on. By the way, this is now urgent because I sat on it for 2 weeks. Me. Okay, but can I have your instructions on the other 6 points which are kind of critical to the drafts? Client. No time. Just send subject to my instructions. Me to other side. Here are the drafts. They're subject to instructions. At some point, when my client gets back to me, I'll confirm the unimportant details that you might be waiting on, like the price, milestone dates, deliverables, and price escalation mechanisms. Story 26. Client requests weekend court prep for Monday hearing. 4:30 p.m. on a Friday. Client. Shoot guys. Received a statement of claim weeks ago, and the court date is on Monday. Need to brief you to appear as soon as possible. The weekend should be enough time for you guys to prepare, right? Story 27. Client ignores drafts, demands urgent meeting. 4:30 p.m. on any weekday. Client: thanks for sending me the draft documents 2 weeks ago. I have not looked at them because I am just so busy at the moment. Nevertheless, please confirm your availability tomorrow morning for a meeting with me and the other side and their lawyers. By the way, this is now urgent because I sat on it for 2 weeks. Times client works 9 to 5 and is sending email from iPad at 6 p.m. Story 28. Client rushes 80-page lease review on last working day. Last working day of the calendar year at 1 p.m. Client: here's an 80-page commercial lease. We want to sign it today. Can you confirm that it's all good to sign? We'll need a legal certification letter too. Thanks. Story 29. The frivolous litigants who filed endless complaints and bar complaints. He then says those words that are music to every lawyer's ears. I find that client's counterclaims frivolous. Mr. Jordan, would you like for me to award attorney's fees for your time in having to defend these frivolous claims? He also enjoined them from filing any more bar complaints in any jurisdiction. Shortly after the order for the attorney's fees had been issued, and the judgment granted, and their appeal to the Ninth Circuit denied, client died. At the recent hearing on the estate, we learned that client's estate and CW currently have 11 separate litigations going against attorneys for malpractice. There are a lot more details that could make this a 10 to 15-page story, including the multiple-hour calls where I would just sit there with them on speaker and play Sudoku while CW ranted on, or how the client who couldn't remember even what year he was married, any of the times, or how he had every check and bank statement he had written or received for the last 60 years in a storage cabinet in order. Story 30. The mentally ill client convinced of a social experiment. Small do a friend a favor. Personal injury client foisted upon me by a senior lawyer in firm. Client had terrible untreated mental illness and called me several times per week to discuss the Truman Show-style social experiment he believed he was the subject of. I was in a terrible ethical spot. I ultimately escaped by senior attorney leaving firm and taking client with him. Story 31. The expert witness who derailed the entire trial. It wasn't a client, but I had an expert witness go WAAAAAY off the rails during cross-examination during a week-long trial a while back. He forgot all his analysis and data and just started spewing nonsense from his mouth. Then he became combative with counsel. Then he started making political statements. He was making things up left and right that were nonsensical and was getting cooked by counsel. I could see the delight in opposing counsel who was having a field day. My client stormed out of the courtroom because he couldn't take it. I was facing the witness stand about 6 feet from our expert in total shock. We were absolutely crushing the case up to this point, and I was watching the scales tip the other way minute by minute. Story 32. The faking injury client caught lifting heavy machinery. Anyway, just before the statute of limitations ran out, I get served, and the guy is claiming he's been injured since the accident. He can't work, he can't walk, can't be intimate with his wife, the whole nine. He wants $250,000, the entirety of my policy, for his pain and suffering. We go to the deposition, and it comes to light that the guy owned his own flooring business for 20 years, retired down to Florida, things didn't work out, and he moved back to work again. Or at least he was until the accident. My lawyer says his injuries are obviously degenerative, from decades of manual labor, and decides to hire a private investigator to follow him around. Sure enough, they catch him on video working and lifting heavy machinery out of his truck like nothing ever happened. Insurance gave him $10,000 because it would have been cheaper than paying a lawyer at trial. To this day, I'm still salty he walked away with cash for that nonsense. Story 33. The client who left profane voicemails leading to contempt charges. Client was being sued and didn't like the opposing counsel or the judge, so he left the court a bunch of voicemails so profane that he was subject to a criminal contempt of court hearing. Story 34. The disrespectful juvenile with total disregard for authority. I don't think he was a sociopath, he just had complete disregard for authority, disrespected the judge and so on. And my superior told me the kids are the worst, they simply don't care. And it was completely true. The cases involving adults that I was assigned were easier to deal with since they genuinely were scared of going to jail. This was during an internship in public defense in Dominican Republic. Sorry if there's bad translation. But that kid just had this smirk all the time. I felt quite uneasy. Story 35. The nurse who administered a fatal injection to a baby. Client was a nurse who had administered a fatal injection. It was a long story. Too long, didn't read. I got her off any charges of negligence. Many years ago, but this case will stay with me forever. After hours, small rural hospital, understaffed and under-equipped, pediatric ward, baby very ill with gastroenteritis and hadn't responded to weeks of treatment, was losing weight despite everything. There was no doctor on the pediatric ward that night, or in fact in the entire hospital, when the lab phoned the baby's blood work results in to the nurse on duty, and said the baby was going to die soon if he didn't receive urgent treatment. Nurse phoned the doctor on telephonic call, who wasn't supposed to go in, having already worked long hours that day, just be available for phone calls, and the doctor gave instructions for a sister to give an ampoule of potassium chloride. Story 36. The drive-through stabber found with morphine. One of my clients stabbed a McDonald's employee through the drive-through window, and when he was arrested, they found 4 grams of powdered morphine in his sock. He was upset that he received a quarter-pounder with cheese, with no burger. Story 37. The shady lawyer who drafted a deed in Comic Sans. A lawyer who drafted someone's deed in Comic Sans. He was a shady garbage lawyer too, but that was just the worst. I'm pretty sure he's retired now, thankfully. Story 38. The newbie lawyer who failed to bring the right interpreter. Then, I see this young guy in a suit. Looks like he just passed the bar but sticks out like a sore thumb. I chuckle, thinking about myself. I was past only a year into practice. The newbie is trying to talk to his clients, 2 young guys, but his Spanish is terrible. Worst part, his clients don't seem to understand. After all, their primary language isn't Spanish, but an indigenous language from Guatemala. Judge calls him up, and he keeps talking in terrible Spanish. Judge goes, "Hello?" And finally they go up, and his case starts. On the record, Judge asks, "Have you explained the purpose and nature of these proceedings?" Newbie lawyer says, "I tried to the best of my ability." What is that supposed to mean? Well, my Spanish isn't perfect. Judge rips him a new one, tells him his clients don't even speak Spanish, and it's his responsibility to come with an interpreter. Story 39. The murderer who bragged to impress the police. Someone I know, not a friend, not anyone I ever liked, is doing 50 years for first-degree harm. During interrogation, he didn't confess, he bragged about how he killed the victim. He wasn't a kid, he was a grown man in his 30s that really believed he was going to impress the police with how much of a badass he was. With a boastful tone, he went through pretty detailed account of how he, and a couple others, beat a person with 2 X4s for over an hour. He honestly believed the cops would be so impressed by his account that they'd be cool and not charge him with anything. I heard the audio of the confession. It was gruesomely eerie, sad and comical all at the same time. Story 40. The RV buyer who misunderstood cruise control. He defended corporations. The worst case of his career, he was defending a recreational vehicle company. Why? Buyer purchased a recreational vehicle with cruise control, a relatively new feature at the time. The buyer thought cruise control meant autopilot, so he set it and went to the back to make a sandwich. Crashed the RV, sued the company for not warning him. Story 41. the client who confessed to an unrelated crime despite advice. Told a client, "Don't say anything to the police, wait until I get there." Confesses to a crime he wasn't being investigated for. Story 42, the client who showed up high and confessed immediately. A client I had came to court higher than a kite. He confessed within 7 minutes because he was high. Story 43, the foreclosure client with a devastating family tragedy. I'm not a lawyer, but I worked in a foreclosure mediation/diversion court as a counselor. Usually it was people with bad luck, unemployment, or addiction that lead them there. Heavy stuff, but became run-of-the-mill. One guy the first will never freaking forget. He comes in and, at first it looks like a standard unemployment deal. There are programs with mortgage companies to deal with. He was a dock worker, made pretty good money but hadn't worked for 6 months and was about to lose the house. I ask for his story and he tells me it all started 20 years ago. His older son was in the army in Korea, at a base on deployment, and his younger son was at a high school party in their town. Apparently he gets into it with another kid over a girl, and the kid grabs a barbecue fork and stabs the son in the neck. His youngest passed away from his injuries before an ambulance arrived. The older son is devastated because he wasn't there to protect his brother. This video does not promote illegal activity. Stories are shared for commentary and education. If you or someone you know is going through a tough time, please remember that help is available. Reaching out to a mental health professional or a crisis hotline can provide you with the support you need.